Hi, my name is Mariana. I am president of the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the first online edition of the 15th Symposium of Irish Studies in South America, Virtual Encounters. Yes. Yes. Sorry. So it is an honor to be chairing this afternoon session, which is the interview with Maurice Fitzpatrick on his film In the Name of Peace, John Hume in America, which is part of the first online film series organized by the William Butler Yeats Chair of Irish Studies, directed by Professor Maurice. At this stage, I would like to introduce His Excellency Sean Boy, currently Ireland's ambassador to Brazil, Guyana, and Suriname since 2018. Before this, he was ambassador in Nigeria, also credited to Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal since 2014. He has also been posted in Mozambique, Uganda, and Vietnam. Also part of this session is Consul General Owen Venice, who arrived in São Paulo this August, and before that, he was working as Deputy Director with responsibility for Central Asia, the Eastern Neighborhood, and the Council of Europe. He also spent time in Ireland's embassy in Ottawa, Canada in 2019. He is a major in history and geography in University College Dublin and holds a passion for Irish studies, culture, and history with a love of Gaelic games. Finally, Maurice Fitzpatrick is a lecturer and film director from Ireland. His latest film and book, John Hume in America, on the political life of Nobel Peace Prize laureate John Hume, has screened in over 30 countries. His book, entitled John Hume in America, From Derry to DC, published in 2019, has been welcomed by Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi as, I quote, a wonderful reminder of the strength in diplomacy and the close relationship between the United States and Northern Ireland, as well as by the Sunday Business Post as one of the, I quote, 20 vital books about the Northern conflict, end quote. Maurice Fitzpatrick is the 2020 Humboldt Chair of Irish Studies at Villanova University, Philadelphia. And now I will take this opportunity to ask the first question. So Maurice, after watching your fascinating film about the American influence on the leading Northern Irish politician, John Hume, who has passed away on 3rd of August of this year, I am sure everybody would be interested to know a little bit more about the importance of acknowledging John Hume as a Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me along. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. I wish I could be there, São Paulo, but it wasn't. Maybe next time. Hume was a peacemaker, as you rightly said. He was a peacemaker from his early childhood, by which I mean he was deeply influenced by his father, whose core lesson to him when he was growing up was you can't eat a flag. You know, Hume grew up in an area of Derry City, on the edge of the Bogside, a poor rundown part of Derry, and he did witness the disaffection on the part of what I call the Catholic majority of the city, because we know that in Northern Ireland, back then certainly the minority was Catholic, but Derry City had this peculiar demographic that it was a strong Catholic majority, nationalist in aspiration, political aspiration, and Hume was very much off that background. But he was also influenced, as I say, by his father, who would say to him, you know, practical politics is the way, son. You know, this tribal politics, we've had an endless cycle of it. It has achieved nothing but recrimination. And another thing to say about Hume's early childhood period was that he was the beneficiary of the 1947 Education Act, which, in a word, instituted mass education to Northern Ireland. He went to St. Colum's College, secondary school, and on to university. And that was hugely transformative for him. There, he encountered things like modern languages, history, philosophy, and logic, and so forth. And he all the more believed that the solution to the rather complex political problems of Northern Ireland was inherently political. That violence had no place in the landscape. Violence only deepened problems. So from the get-go, Mariana, he was a man of peace, and his detractors, his critics, everyone would acknowledge that much. That there's absolute agreement on that. That his methods were exclusively constitutional and non-violent. And it's not surprising, I suppose, that his earliest appearance, his earliest intervention in public life in Ireland was in the form of business initiatives in his native city, Derry, in the form of writing newspaper articles, just explaining one famous one known as a series of articles called The Northern Catholic, just explaining to a principally Dublin or Southern readership what the situation was in the North. And then ultimately, when he embraced the civil rights movement and politics in the late 1960s, again, it was resolutely of this view that one could only achieve political reform and political progress through political means. So yeah, from the get-go, a man of peace.
Can I open with a question, Maurice?
By all means.
Pleasure, and thanks for joining us this evening, and thanks to Mariana for the kind introduction. Yeah, as you say, a man of peace and honesty. Sort of, I suppose, a man for the people. He wasn't above. He was together with all of those people, whether it was in Northern Ireland and beyond. But just to get a sense, and as we're starting off, I'm from Dublin myself. I don't have a huge affiliation to Derry. Growing up as a teenager, education-wise, a lot of focus on history of Ireland, Great Britain to a degree, Europe, but not a huge amount in terms of analysis anyway on what was happening in Northern Ireland. So my first real, I guess, real idea about the sense of what people were dealing with in the North came from when I was playing football and we went up to the Brandywell, which, as you know, was very much in the Bogside. John Hume was very much a Derry City supporter and was often found watching Derry City's matches. But what struck me, I was about 17, 18 at the time, what struck me was the murals, was the change in terms of just there was an atmosphere. It was very much sort of us and them. And I guess, it sort of pushed me in a way a little bit to sort of maybe to think about John Hume, or to think about what was happening in the North a lot more. And I'm just wondering, from your own point of view, where did your interest come from? And this film, a remarkable insight. But I'm just wondering where you got, I suppose, the motivation or the interest, or what sort of provoked you to take the journey that has resulted in what is an amazing insight.
Thank you for the question, Owen. This film, John Hume in America, grew out of a previous production called The Boys of St. Colum's, and you've referenced Brandywell Stadium. St. Colum's College is just up the hill from Brandywell. Derry is a very compact city, and everything is walkable. And St. Colum's College, I've referred to earlier, was the school that John Hume went to as a teenager. And it's quite remarkable. It's a remarkable distinction in that not one but two Nobelists have emerged from its hallowed halls, Hume being one and Seamus Heaney, the poet, being the other. And I got the idea to develop a documentary about not only their time at school, but also to try to see their schooling in a broader historical sense. These were people, it was a boys' school, so young lads from farming backgrounds, from working class backgrounds, getting an education and really forcing change in their society a generation thereafter in the late 1960s. And Hume is a prime example of this. So I was quite interested to explore that whole milieu. and to interview those people who went to that school at that time. And I did. And I remember very, very well interviewing Hume in the college. He referred to, just in passing, referred to this connection with Washington. I hadn't heard, I studied history at school. I liked history a lot, but I had never heard this aspect of Irish history before, that very senior congressmen had become very committed to intervening in Anglo-Irish relations to the good. I mean, to take a seat at the table and to try to ensure that good faith negotiations should occur, and that progress should happen in Northern Ireland, that recognition of the Irish dimension in Northern Ireland should happen. These senior congressmen, I'm referring to the four horsemen as they became known: Speaker Tip O'Neill, Senator Kennedy, Senator Moynihan, and Governor of New York, Kerry. So, I mean, I just thought, here's Hume telling me this in this school where he went all those years before, and I just thought, that's a story. I want to develop that story. And that was the seed, indeed, of John Hume in America. I was lucky to be a visiting scholar in a university in Pennsylvania a couple of years later after that production. Gave me a chance to go into Washington and to conduct some pre-interviews. So really out of straight from the horse's mouth from John Hume, and out of that previous production came the idea to explore Hume's life's work a bit further.
Thanks, Maurice.
Thanks, Mariana. And if I could come in here maybe and introduce myself. I'm Sean. I'm currently the ambassador here in Brazil. But I mean, unlike Owen, I was born in Northern Ireland and then moved to work in Dublin when I was 21. And I've always been working in Dublin, and joined the Foreign Service, and fortunate to have this position. But I suppose a question I have is that, you know, John Hume, I grew up with all of those things you talk about. I voted for him when he went to become a member of Parliament in the European Parliament. And I lived through the peace process. I was in White River in South Africa the night that the Good Friday Agreement was signed. I remember that, you know, it was a time of great hope. And of course, the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, is still being implemented. But I've lived through that time 22 years later. And, you know, as I often say, my children have inherited a better life because of that peace. And if you ever want to know what peace is, you can see it in the eyes of your children. And, you know, but lots of people, and we hope that somebody watching today will be inspired by this, because I think this is part of the reason, Mariana, why you selected this particular work as part of the screening, and why we're having this discussion. But I mean, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, John Hume, they have a lot in common. But you can't create these people. They are very special people. Greta Thunberg is perhaps somebody from the next generation that has it. I mean, they have something special, which of course makes them great material for a film director, I think. But I mean, what makes them special? What do you think are those ingredients? And maybe we have the next John Hume watching. I mean, how would you move that person onto the next space in terms of inspiring them?
John Hume combined many important talents in a political leader. He was extremely confident of his analysis of the situation that he's born into and grew up in. He thought very long about where exactly his time was in relation to broader spheres, like relation to the rest of Ireland, the United Kingdom, burgeoning European community. He formed an analysis very young, and he stuck by it. This is one thing, as you know very well, Sean, from voting for him down the years. This wasn't a man who changed his message. He was very, very clear about what his message was, and he stuck to it. You've referred to the Good Friday Agreement. So many of the concepts that Hume outlined, even before the Troubles erupted in the streets, are reflected now in that agreement. So this was a new conceptual framework he outlined, he and others, but he was a very principal prime mover in this. He outlined. So baseline to Hume, I think, is his intellectual capacity. Added to that, though, crucially, his confidence in his analysis, his courage in defending it. And let's also remember he had great creativity. It's one thing to have, so to speak, the right answer, or something like the right answer, something that's that you can bring to the people and the people can sign up to and follow with confidence. Well, it's another thing to bring it to the wider world. And I've already mentioned the United States Congress. Mariana, in her kind introduction, mentioned, Speaker Pelosi, who repeatedly has referred to Hume's example, as has in very recent times the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. So he's an example to senior figures now, and he was down the decades. And I think he exhibited great political skill in going to meet the right people, managing to be in the right place, and being able to convey to people who maybe had a different analysis or maybe weren't so well schooled, so to say, in the whole nuances of what was happening in the North. He was able to convince them, able to convey to them what was happening, and also, crucially, able to convey to them what they could do. If they were to get involved, how could they do so constructively? One sterling example comes to mind, and it features in the film, how when Senator Kennedy was coming to Bonn, former capital of West Germany, for a NATO meeting, and he phoned the Hume house and said, listen, can we meet? And Hume immediately flew to Germany to meet Kennedy, and they sat down. The good offices of the Irish ambassador in Bonn at the time, Sean G. Rowan, he set a room aside and they would sit down and talk about the Northern issue. And Kennedy emerged from that meeting saying, what Hume is saying is what I will follow, and I will make sure this is put on the agenda in the United States Congress. That's an extraordinary consequence of one single meeting. And you can find that throughout Hume's career. I just very recently came upon a diplomatic file of Margaret Thatcher's first meeting with Hume, and her reaction afterwards was she couldn't believe how flexible he was. Maybe she had an impression, he's going to hit me with Irish nationalism and anti-colonial bitterness, or I don't know what her preconception was, but rather she found in him a very reliable touchstone. And it's not the case that they agreed on everything, quite the contrary, but he was good at forming relationships and getting the business of politics done, extremely good at that. And I think, to go to the other part of your question, John, I think there's a great example in that for any person in politics, the need to do that, rather than what we see a lot today, the collapse of cooperation, the collapse of bipartisan approaches to things or multilateral approaches to things. Hume would find that a very disappointing, very counterproductive approach to politics.
If I can just pick up on one aspect of that, Maurice, and the word authentic is something that we hear about much more in modern times. But in the 60s and 70s, as you've just correctly sort of set out, John Hume was his most authentic in the sense that he introduced himself as himself with no agenda as such. And I think that's been remarked on by a number of commentators. But he was able and had that ability to listen and not just talk. And I know his words were important, but he was able to listen to the other side and get their perspectives. And we know about his, I suppose, his somewhat secret meetings maybe with Jerry Adams, and obviously his relationship that he built across the globe. But where does that come from? I'm just intrigued, and education is a part of it, absolutely. But is it his background? Is it his family upbringing? Where does that come from? Because you talk about lessons for leaders today, and any sort of course you go on these days, they talk about being open, having that space for conversation, dialogue, and listening. And I'm just wondering, how did John Hume become that person? Was it all built up by his experience in Derry City, or was there a mentor? Or just be interested on your views on that.
Thanks, Owen. It's, of course, in a way, impossible to answer conclusively. I could probably give you a few ideas. One of the most salient aspects of his character was his rationality. And I know from people who would have worked with him down the years, say speechwriters and people who had to spend time with him when he was working his way through some of the more complex aspects of negotiation, and they would find him an extremely brooding person, difficult to access, difficult to get a word out of. What was happening, of course, was he was thinking things through. And when he did say something, he wanted it, he understood that in a place like Northern Ireland, the wrong word, the wrong sentence can be misinterpreted, can have really terrible consequences, even lethal consequences. And I think he did have a strong moral sense. Where that came from, a strong moral sense not to do that, not to mislead people, not to deceive people, and not to bring about negative events in people's lives. It's a real mystery, really, what nurture and nature. I do think it's worth setting down that Hume was born and remained all his life a Catholic, and he was quite influenced by the church. The doctrines of, thou shalt not kill, he would have taken something like that, I think, that commandment as an absolute imperative, and he applied this in political negotiations and reaching out. You've mentioned to the IRA, you talk about your rights, your political rights, and so on. How can you talk about human rights and civil rights if you don't accept the most basic right of them all, and that is the right to life? How can you deny somebody the right to life? What gives you that right? And he kept going. He kept with that line. He was very, very intent on bringing that into discourse in Northern Ireland. And the IRA was one dimension, but of course you also had terror sponsored by loyalist paramilitaries and indeed by the British state. So Hume found all of that very repulsive, and there are, very disturbing images of him at certain points, he breaking down and he being very emotionally affected by what it meant to be, he was a citizen of the North at the time, but certainly to be a political leader in the North at the time. Whereas for others, and I don't think I'll go into names here, but for others, the fact that you could say something that would incite hatred, you could say something that would incite violence and murder, seemed to be water off a duck's back. I mean, there's archive. It's worth remembering that there were people who quite blithely advocated hurting people, including, I mean, maybe not always with full intent, including civilians, but sometimes with intent as well, targeting civilians and civilian congregations. So for Hume, that was all deeply repulsive and completely contrary to an idea of a republic. Res publica is a place of the people, for the people to decide, for the people to elect, to rule. It was all absurd. And I just go back to that point, just to repeat myself, this rationality shone through Hume very, very clearly. Have a look at the interviews when he's being assailed by, his critics, being doubted, his motives being, doubted, and aspersions being cast. He always goes back to a very clear-headed analysis, rational analysis of the situation. Sometimes actually to the irritation of the people who had to hear it, because theirs was a far more fiery brand. We've got our objectives and we'll stop at nothing to get them. And they found Hume's approach occasionally very disconcerting. They didn't know what to do with this. And indeed, a lot of them now, in fullness of time, have absorbed his language, have copied the language that he used, because it has in the end proved most durable.
Interesting.
Maybe if I could, I think this is really fascinating, Maurice. It's just you mentioned the Education Act, and certainly, every family saw the advantage of that. But economic development was also very critical, because, Hume started by trying to improve the welfare of the people that he represented. His own father never worked since the end of the Second World War. And, he talks about the very bipolar development in Northern Ireland. Everywhere east of the Bann was invested in, and the part that I lived in, in our farmhouse where we live now, we didn't get electricity to 1966. And as I've lived in other parts of the developing world, people find that incredible to believe, that my parents grew up in houses without power. And, one of the last places in developed Europe and certainly one of the last places in the United Kingdom to get electricity. So, economic development, you look at people living in the bog side, it could be like people living in a favela, perhaps in Brazil, densely populated, no employment, and yet there was always hope. And then you had a leader that could arise there and create that hope. And I'm just wondering, in your research, where did that hope come from? Hume trained in Maynooth initially to be a seminarian, to be a priest. He had his faith, which you've mentioned, and hope is a big part of the Catholic faith, of course. But, to bring everybody with him, that was a huge achievement, I think.
Absolutely, it was. When Hume was buried in Derry, one of his sons wrote a poem, and he quoted something that Hume would often say, that the border in Ireland is just a line on the map. The real border we have to address is the border in people's hearts and minds. And in a way, people could say that's a little bit off the wall. Of course, there's a geographical territorial border, and it's all important, but actually not. And again, he had this almost fanatical belief in his analysis being correct. He believed that you need to break down these barriers between people within Northern Ireland, people within, say, even a city like Derry City. It's a very divided city. You need to build the community. And I think much as that was an extremely difficult job to do, it was literally a life's work. Much as he had, for every advance, I suppose he had about 20 or 30 setbacks. Nevertheless, I think conceptually that makes such perfect sense that if you simply persist with that, it's something that it's a flag to which everyone can rally. It's something towards which everyone will happily go. I'll give a concrete example. His earliest campaign was a campaign to establish a university in Derry. There wasn't a university in Derry to this day. There still isn't. There's a minor campus of the University of Ulster, but it's underfunded. And Hume believed that there should be a proper university in what was referred to as the second city in Northern Ireland. And guess what happened? The whole city got behind that. The Unionist mayor, the Unionist politicians, Unionist community, also saw, well, this, irrespective of whether you're a nationalist or unionist, this does make a lot of sense to everyone. It's education for our children, it's jobs, it's prosperity, and it's, to go back to your word, Sean, it's hope. It's a bit of hope for the future. And for Hume, that was so self-evident that you should aim towards that. So, you know, the old cliche, hope springs eternal, but you do have in very, very basic ideas that Hume put forward a great deal of hope. Now, of course, that it was accompanied by a great deal of frustration, half a century of frustration, starting with the Lockwood Report that basically stymied the placement of the university in Derry. It was a very malicious sectarian, was done with sectarian intent. Hume saw that. It would be depressing to anyone to witness that. But that doesn't mean you give up. That means you keep finding ways. You don't change your objectives. You find ways to meet your objectives. And I think that does explain the full scope of Hume's ambition to go from, you know, Strasbourg, Brussels, London, Washington, to go where he needed to go to deliver a better future and to deliver some of that hope. I mean, in his Nobel lecture, he refers to, you know, giving the children so that our children can look to the future with a smile of hope. It's as simple as that. That's what he was about. That's why he got involved in politics.
If I can just pick that up, Maurice, in terms of you know, bringing people with him, and if we can just bring ourselves back to early 72, January 72, 1972, and you know, we've spoken about it a brief little bit about what happened on McGilligan Strand, and the images we saw so beautifully directed, but also so I suppose such an insight into who John Hume was, in terms of his ability to stay calm amidst a non-calm scenario. We saw the paratrooper, we saw the crowds, and then, you know, if I could just take that on, a week later we saw what happened with Bloody Sunday in the space of that week, and John Hume didn't attend. But I'd love just to hear your views on that episode on McGilligan Beach, and where do things go from there? That sort of I suppose demonstration of calmness, peace, consistent message, and then a week later we have the atrocities of Bloody Sunday. You know, a powerful week, and so many powerful images, hard to see, but powerful all the same.
Yeah, thanks. I did a lot of work on that McGilligan sequence, by which I mean filming. I spoke to Mrs. Pat Hume and I said, you know, this is going to be an important part of the film, and could we bring John out to McGilligan? And indeed we did. We drove out to McGilligan, so filmed John there, and I also got access to some archive of the turnaround Tuesday moment. Martin Luther King was determined to lead a march from Selma to Montgomery, and especially over the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the outskirts of Selma. And I wanted to, in a way, draw a visual parallel between what Martin Luther King did in Turnaround Tuesday, which basically he didn't, I'm not saying he relented, he didn't push on at that point, because the non-violent marchers, you know, he felt and Hume felt the very same, he felt a great responsibility for their security, for their well-being. And one always has to make an assessment of the potential for extreme violence and maybe even lethal violence. And what King was doing in his negotiations with President Lyndon Johnson at the time was leveraging the street protests down in Alabama to get legislation passed in Washington. Similarly, Hume understood the absolute need for conducting a civil rights movement, but also making it clear, you know, there are lines. We have to protect men, women, and children here. And he felt that the presence on McGilligan Strand that day was a very ill omen for what could happen in Derry the following week. So he does remonstrate with the paratrooper in that footage. It's really unforgettable footage. Anyone seen the film will remember it. The paratrooper is brimful of arrogance and very dismissive of what Hume is trying to propose. Again, extremely good example of Hume's rationality. What, show me, tell me the legislate, tell me the authority. And he's speaking there not only as a civil rights leader, but also as a member of parliament. So he has a mandate. He has a right to know with what political or legal authority that the paratroopers are standing there and doing what they're doing. But then also this moral responsibility. He felt that he couldn't identify with the march happening in Derry the following week. And we know from, the whole world history, and especially 20th century history, we know what happens when extreme brutality is visited upon nonviolent protesters. They harden their resolve, more people emerge onto the streets, and tragically, the government of the United Kingdom and its army behaved as it did, and I'm saying government as well, and the violence that occurred, the death that occurred in Bloody Sunday, really gave the Provisional IRA the argument that they wanted to step up its campaign of violence, and it really made the work of someone like John Hume advocating a constitutional approach much more difficult. So it was a lose-lose situation, and to go back to the concept of hope, it was hard to have hope in a moment like that, very hard, and yet that was, as Hume saw, that was the role of a political leader.
Maybe Maurice, if I could just ask about, after John Hume died, right? I think when you first released the movie, or the documentary, whatever, and you've toured the world presenting it, but I think when John died, the positive comments on him from across the political spectrum, including from people that he would have had to confront, engage difficultly with, but everybody remembered him in a very positive way. And, I've been reading some of those comments from from David Trimble, from Tony Blair, from the US as well, and they're all consistently positive. But, he was also somebody that was beyond scandal. He never had a secret life. In this modern day and political world, you can always be caught out on something, but John Hume never had a private life. He never had, a vulnerability or an Achilles heel that anybody has ever commented on anyway. And I'm just interested, always when somebody passes away, there's a kind of a revisionist history. How important really were they? But, in your own interviews that you've conducted this year with Seamus Mallon also passing away this year, I mean, it's largely been positive. And has that been your experience everywhere as well?
Well, yes. I mean, the response to Hume's passing was quite extraordinary, really extraordinary. And as you rightly say, some of his erstwhile critics had to eat some humble pie and recant. It's a gradual process too, but of course, the moment of the man's death brings it out in a very crystallizes people's positions, I suppose. But the question about revisionism is a good one. Let's remember Hume left the political stage very shortly after the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So he's been basically absent from the public scene, the political scene in the 21st century. And his party is also, its electoral standing has fallen quite considerably. And instead, you've had, I mean, Clinton makes this point in the film actually, that Hume, when he supported the Good Friday Agreement, when he pushed for all sides to sign up to it, he knew very well that he was potentially doing some damage to his party, because his party, and indeed the UUP, the Unionist Party, more centrist parties, could potentially be pushed out of the way by the more hardline parties, the people who would most, as Clinton said, most fiercely advocate their positions. But Hume's eye was on the prize being peace as a precondition for doing proper politics. But still, the revisionism has happened, and given that he's off the stage, he hasn't been in a position to rebuff it or to enter dialogue with people who would revise history. It's been a case, Sean, I think, more of not diminishing John Hume. I think that most people are wise enough not to do that, but to try to maybe diminish the work that was achieved in the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s. There was a long trajectory, a long consolidation, well, I'll say consolidation of Hume's approach throughout those decades that did bring as a capstone, the crowning achievement of Hume was the Good Friday Agreement, but it didn't come out of nothing. And it was very important to bring together all these strands. And in the writing of very recent Irish history, you have had a concentration on the late 1990s and on the role of the said hardline entities. And they're the ones who are advocating this narrative. My narrative in the film, in the book I've written, is of a much longer view of the history. And that's why I go right back to the post-war years, the educational reform, the new thinking, the new politics that emerged in the 1960s, and the commitment of people like Hume to forging a new society right from that point. And really importantly here, repudiating violent means, because you could, if people who back then took up the gun or advocated the use of force, and who today say, well, that's all past. But it was justifiable back then. I'm very firm, and in everything I've written, in any film I've made, I'm very firm in trying to demonstrate that is simply not the case. That the so-called justifications for this very long campaign of violence are all threadbare. They don't stand up to proper scrutiny.
Can I ask a question, Maurice? I was thinking about on the film, there is a recurrent image, overhead image of the boats crossing. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this and about your own decision in focusing on the influence of the US in his politics.
Yeah, by all means. Thank you, Mariana. The boats, that's an area very dear to my heart. I grew up in Belturbet, County Cavan, and that area, the Gad Island features quite a bit there. It's an outlier of Cromcastle. It's just on the border. It's on the border between Cavan, Fermanagh, which is to say the border between Northern Ireland and the South, or if you like, the Republic of Ireland. And historically, my grandfather's time, let's say, a place like Enniskillen, which is in the north, it's in County Fermanagh, was a very natural place to go by boat, go to Enniskillen, buy something. There might have been a little bit of smuggling, I don't know. But there was traffic, there was trade, there was a communication between the north, and it was done on the river. Of course, as time, things evolve and people get cars and so on, the role of the river became less. But to me, it's my homeland, it's my home place. And I wanted to show in a way that this border we talk about as though it's subspecie aeternitatis. I mean, for a start, it's invisible, one side of one little stream or rivulet or something, some ancient little bridge, and you can be playful with it, and you should be. You should have tried to augment that space around the border, just as the French and Germans have done in Alsace, which was historically, a contested place. To this day, you go. I'm phoning you actually from Germany. You go just 20 miles from here. You go to a place like Wissembourg or Strasbourg, and the French and Germans have different ways of pronouncing the words, the towns, but they're very at ease with this place that's now technically it's in France, but it's also a bicultural place, and I think we need to be creative and augment that space around the border. On the theme of, let me try and link that with your other question about engaging America.
In fact, I was actually thinking about the crossing, like the Irish crossing the Atlantic and
sure.
the American influence.
Yeah, exactly. St. Brendan discovering America on an open rowboat, maybe. But again, just to stick with the border area for one moment. On the northern side of the border, you have things like castles, beautifully preserved. Get funding from the UK government to sustain these. To a lot of people's minds, are kind of archaic, old places. And then in the southern side, you have places that are, because they're in the south, they've been let to rack and ruin. They haven't been preserved because, in a way, that's not a culture that the Irish, the Free State, when it was founded, that the Free State did not associate with that unionist culture and that hierarchical idea of how to construct a society. There's a border writer, beautiful writer. He just died from County Monaghan. Eugene McCabe, and he's written a lot of beautiful work, plays and short stories about the border area. And he also remarked, I remember once, about growing up where he did in Monaghan and being aware of the attitudes of what he would call big house unionists, people who would maybe look down on the like of him. He was farming stock growing up, and there was that hierarchy in Irish society going back the centuries. And what I would argue is one of the consequences of, say, the Irish going to America and say what Hume did at the federal level of political power in the United States was that he brought to the negotiating table, the presence of a superpower. And it was not a power that the British could easily ignore. They couldn't ignore it at all. And in turn, the Unionists couldn't ignore this. And this really changed the game entirely. And it was important because I think it's easy to forget this or not to fully understand it in the first instance, that there was, from the inception of Northern Ireland, a deeply divided, almost a caste system. Seamus Heaney once referred to growing up in South Derry. There was a caste system, and he felt he was outside from the ruling caste. There was a glass ceiling. There was a way. The Catholic minority were not going far in that society without political reform. So it's no mystery, therefore, that someone like John Hume, the first idea in his mind is reform. He was a truly radical politician. People don't always recognize that because they see him more as a gradualist, a moderate and so forth. But he did want and demand radical reform as well, because the society into which he was born was completely unsustainable.
If I could just come in, Maurice, and thanks so far. The discussion has been fascinating up to now. I just have a question, and you rightly say, once the Good Friday Agreement came in '98, and very shortly afterwards, John Hume himself would have taken himself out of, I suppose, the political space, in a sense that we wouldn't have seen him on stage, as you said. Fast forward to today, and more than most of us, the power of social media, good and bad in terms of its role, and I suppose the new dimension that brings to, I suppose, political, civil society space, etc. Some might say there's a new generation of politicians out there who are using social media for good and for bad. We see it all the time: disinformation, fake news. But also, some might suggest that it's a safe space that people can express themselves in a manner that keeps them safe and distant from potential harm. How do you think, I suppose, John Hume would sort of, how would he take to this, I suppose, new dimension, or how would he bring himself to it? It's a difficult one, maybe, but I would just be interested, because I do think he was ahead of his time. In terms, like we said earlier, about how he approached his rationality, etc., his ability to listen and not just jump. How do you think he would deal in this new space and this new dimension, or a new generation of politician?
It's a good question. Maybe one of the is to start on solid ground before speculating too much. When we look at what he did in the 1960s, he emerged as a public figure. He was, I'm quoting here people like Robert Fisk, who covered the North. He covered the North for the Times in London, and wrote a book called The Point of No Return about his time in the North. Fisk often remarked about how intelligent a media operator John Hume was. He knew there'd be a cut on the tape. He knew he had to get to the point. He knew, I think, Fisk didn't say this, but I'm going to say it. He knew who to talk to in the media. He knew how to pick his man or his woman, to find somebody like, say, Mary Mulholland or Robert Fisk, somebody who he could open up to. He could give a story. He could give hard information to. And equally, he knew who not to trust in the media. So I think, yes, he was a new kid on the block in the 1960s, able to communicate very effectively to the broader media, British media and the United States media. And so I do a segment on the media in the film about the way in which he communicated to people who wrote op-ed columns, editorials in major newspapers in the United States. I mean, I think that's a very important part of Hume's agenda. He, again, found the right people. He found people who were receptive, people who were well-read and reflective about the situation in the North. People who maybe they had a particular perspective, but they were also open to the other side, because the North, it's almost the first thing you have to acknowledge about the place, its plurality. And Hume was very clear in his mind that he had to communicate that as well. There's no victory possible here. We have, the only victory possible really is a victory for all sides, but no triumphalism. And to any member of the nationalist minority growing up in the North, triumphalism had very negative connotations. He knew all about it and didn't want to know any more. So I think he would have been good. He was good at media all his life, but equally, I think, Owen, a little cautious as well. Social media is routinely misused, and we do also live in an age where people are hung out to dry for retweeting something that might not, didn't get the pronoun right, and suddenly their careers are over, or they're being lambasted. There's a lot of injustice about the way in which a very central right to any of us, and certainly to John Hume, is freedom of speech. The way in which that's being curtailed, and how mobbing also occurs in social media. So I think he would have been quite conscious of the deleterious effects of social media as well.
No, it's interesting. I just think, and before the ambassador comes in, I just think myself personally, I think he would have dealt with it very well, because it goes back to what you say. He had the ability to step back and think about actions before doing them, and I think he would have used social media, as he did his connections in America, as he did his connections in the EU, to carry on his message and to keep that message going in a consistent manner. I think he would have adapted quite well. I think, Thanks, Maurice.
Thanks, Maurice. And I mean, in a sense, I don't really have another question other than because I believe we have a Brazilian live audience, and maybe Marianne is going to take some questions. But I suppose just to finish, I mean, anybody that hasn't seen this documentary or film, I certainly hope that over the last hour we've given you a real appetite for the substance and depth that's in it. It's very valuable to us here in the embassy because if it creates an interest and a discussion, we want to continue that both here in Brasilia and with Owen in Sao Paulo and anywhere possible, because I think our peace process is something that we can bring to others. And from the moment that it was achieved, we were prepared to share it. And, in this region, in Colombia, Eamon Gilmore has been a very major contributor, but we take the lessons everywhere. And the important thing is it's a process. It's not something that was a simple bridge that was built and it's in the past. There are challenges, and there are challenges that we live with today. But perhaps my last question to you, Maurice, before we open up the audience, is you brought this around the world. You've spoken to different groups around the world. I mean, is there anywhere that it was not well received, or was there anybody that had a completely different take on the story to what you were trying to present? I guess that's a nice, easy one to end with. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I do believe it was well received in most places I brought it to. Of course, you have different levels of local knowledge, and starting with the north, broadening out to the whole island of Ireland, and then say our near neighbours across the sea in England and in Scotland. I brought it to all of those places, Stormont, this in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and then screening the Irish government as well, and in Leinster House. And in Westminster, I remember a very memorable screening with involving the then chief whip of the Democratic Unionist Party, Jeffrey Donaldson, at a time when the DUP was the kingmaker for the Conservative Party in the UK Parliament. So what he was doing, and the Conservatives were doing, and still are doing in a way, the Conservatives certainly, was very antithetical to John Hume's vision of an inclusive and agreed approach. So it's been interesting for me. I mean, there we're not only dealing with somebody who's got, of course, knowledge of the situation. Jeffrey Donaldson has been elected since 1985 consecutively, but also a person who brings a very different perspective to this whole history as a unionist and as a unionist leader. I remember being very moved that actually at that screening in Westminster, he basically said, if it wasn't for John Hume, we wouldn't be sitting here having this discussion. It was as simple as that. He was way ahead in his thinking about how to resolve the Northern issue, how to achieve a negotiated settlement. And he said, we unionists, we were stuck in our siege mentality. He said all these things quite frankly, and they were later reprinted. His words were reprinted in the Irish Times. Michael Lillis, a diplomat, had a letter in the Irish Times about this. He was also a participant in that panel discussion. So I suppose it's not a question of maybe places receiving it badly or particularly well, but rather different levels of knowledge and different levels of involvement in the ongoing outworking of this history. But it's intriguing to me. I remember, certain screenings, you might not think Copenhagen in Denmark is going to be a you might think that they don't have a huge relationship with this, but I remember it was a spectacular screening, really interesting. I've loved being on the road with Japan, Australia, you name it, China, all over the place. Follow, as Mark Twain said about one of his books, following the equator.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much, Maurice. So many issues of the film actually resonate, I think, with the Brazilian audience. And to my mind, I think that a very important aspect is, of course, education and inequality, as Sean has mentioned, and Robert Fisk's affirmation that it is reason and not emotion that you need to solve problems. And I think that the Brazilian people have been very emotional lately with so many happenings, which of course I won't deal with at this moment, but unprecedented bipolarity in terms of political stance. And so I think that how can this be, I mean, like, how can a society overcome this, especially a society in which education is so unequal, access to education is so unequal? I think that the film brings a message of hope because it is through dialogue and nonviolence that we can reach a solution. And of course, this also brings to my mind the scene on Magilligan Beach, in which the political violence against police violence against Brazilians is also frequent in the favelas. And so I think that your film can also make us connect with this, and also, of course, the rising of John Hume, as we were mentioning before, and of course Lula as a political leader coming from who used to be a union leader who became a president, but then eventually lost political support. And so I was thinking also about what we were thinking about how did Hume retain his long-lasting political support throughout his career. So I think that so many issues resonate with Brazil and a Brazilian audience. And I'm bringing all this before we go into questions, but into the questions, because you have many questions from the audience. So if you'd like to just speak briefly about anything that I have said.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. I think a very important concept here is education. Indeed, we have circled around the 1947 Education Act, but that not only helped to, I suppose, Hume would say he couldn't have made the progress in the world that he made without having had that basic education. Of course, that's correct, but also his support base was an educated support base. There was a more educated approach to politics in the 1960s. There's quite irrespective of any personality, any particular focus on John Hume. You had an appetite for change based on very sound reasoning. And that's why I included the Robert Fisk comment. In some ways it might be tangential, but it's also a very important one. Fisk has covered areas of conflict all his life. And I think Hume does represent a very clear-headed, very educated approach to solving a complex problem. And also, remaining very, very wedded to your base, being able to lead them, being a source of credibility. Why do they stay with him all those years? I mean, he did continually, never lost an election. He continually kept winning in seats in wider spheres in the UK Parliament, in Europe, and so on. I think he was, quite apart from all the history and sociology we've talked about, though, we have to also acknowledge a native talent, and I will say genius, actually. he was very, very astute at reading the situation and being able to position himself and position the agenda he was trying to advance in the most favorable way. Somebody, a BBC reporter who covered the North for many years, was interviewed recently when Hume died. And he said, this BBC journalist said, I never saw Hume bested in a debate. That's just simply a fact. He could always hold his own. He could face whoever he was facing. And that's also part of this enormous intellectual creative ability he had. And this vision, I think it's a very hackneyed word people use these days, vision. People have vision of everything, but he really, truly had a vision of where the North needed to go and how to get there.
Okay, thanks, Maurice. And so now let's see. Laura Zaha has a question, and she has asked, which are the tools that a documentary film director has to express the human side of the historical figure?
Thanks. I think the tools a documentary has are kind of underused in my attempt with John Hume here. I'm very almost absolutely focused on his political life rather than his life in toto. But the tools you have, I mean, you can approach, of course, people who knew him as a friend only rather than a political colleague or journalist or so on. You can approach the family. You can attempt to film him in more domestic situations, or him or her. You can, I suppose, attempt to assess the cost that came with making this huge commitment to peace and political reform in Northern Ireland. It did come at a huge toll. He was absent quite a lot, and as often as not, he was in the air, traveling here, there, and everywhere. So there is that, but frankly, it isn't my area of interest, and I also don't think it's objectively as interesting as trying to find out how this man did what he did. He was a professional politician, utterly professional, and I think Sean had a question earlier about, say, a contemporary politician. What might he or she glean from a view of Hume's political career? I think that's really what I would suggest focusing on, because yes, the fact that he was a busy man and he was a man of his time as well. It's a story, but it's not the type of story I'm inclined to tell, and I don't think it's the type of story that is the most salient and that is dare I say it, is the most relevant. I think what's relevant here is his political legacy.
Okay, so thank you, Maurice, and thank you, Laura, for your question. And okay, so Tiago asked, he actually says, Maurice was able to interview a lot of important people among celebrities and former heads of state. I was wondering if you could speak about this process of collecting these interviews.
Yeah, thanks, Tiago. It was a long slog, a long, hard work. I think some of the milestones, the fact that President Bill Clinton is involved in the film, the fact that President Jimmy Carter is in the film, those were really important milestones for me, because I was taking this film to film funders, proposing that I do this, and it is a tall order. You can write and you can say you're going to do something, but to actually deliver the participation of world leaders, and in the case of Carter, fellow Nobel Peace Prize winner as well, it does take some, I suppose, luck, persistence, And it's an absolutely key aspect of the production, the access to these people, because yes, they're well-known world figures, but they were there. They can say, I did this and John said that to me and so on. That it is original and important testimony, married with the fact that they're well-known figures. So that was a big proportion. It was of the workload. It was, the submerged aspect of the iceberg. It was a huge labor to get everyone on board. And I think I'm certain about this. A lot of people did it for John. They did it because they were very proud of their association with John Hume and very happy to participate in something that recorded that history.
Thanks. We've actually met Michael Lelis. He's been to Brazil. So I was very happy to see that I actually know someone in the film, and yes, because of his research on Eliza Lynch, and yes. So, and then we have another question about yes. So Jessica Grant, as John Hume talked about the ordinary people from Northern Ireland, and he was elected by these people. I kept wondering how these people saw him and his legacy.
The first and most abiding response from what Jessica, I think the name was, has said, the ordinary people of Northern Ireland, the most abiding response is gratitude. And that was very, very clear with his passing, the sense that he did all this work, and it's only now with his passing we really see the full trajectory of what he did. Another response has been to recognize that the Ireland, the North and the Ireland that we now live in is very much fashioned by John Hume, the conceptual framework he outlined. So there's a sense that this man and his legacy is very much part of our ongoing reality. And I think that's been those have been the two biggest responses. And in a way, although he was in his 80s, he had a long-standing ailment, but there was also a hurt there that he had passed, and he was very much one of us, and it was a moment of national grief as well.
Thanks. And there is another question by Laura, who is also who is the figure behind the organization of the film series. And so Laura asks, Hume was caught in the middle of opposing forces. Are there letters where he describes his own feelings and frustrations?
I only wish there were, Laura, a few more letters. Hume, I mean, I was rereading a letter he wrote to Gerry Adams at the inception of the Hume-Adams dialogue. He was a very good writer, but I think he was just overwhelmed with the amount of work on his desk, and he didn't write many letters, unfortunately. I would love to be able to read a few more letters by John Hume. And you will also find, to just make this disappointment all the more, you will find that what written communications exist from John Hume will not be personalized letters. There will be, again, the business of politics. But he did, he had very, very close friends whom he could speak to. You mentioned Michael Lelis there a moment ago. He would open up to certain people, certainly in a personal capacity too. But unfortunately not in letters, I don't think. I've certainly never read one.
Okay, thank you. And Owen, I think, has a question.
Yeah, if I can, Maurice, thanks, and thanks, Mariana, just on the whole area of legacy, but also, and you mentioned Pat Hume, his wife, earlier on in the conversation, and let's not forget, she is left while John Hume has gone and passed. In terms of legacy and in terms of the role of Pat Hume, and I guess women in conflict and peace, her own role in the background while quiet was also remarkable. To I suppose commit to a life of supporting John Hume, but also now going forward to commit to a life of ensuring his message goes out there and is maintained. I think that's as important in terms of his legacy. I understand there's a John and Pat Hume Foundation due to be launched shortly, and I think we talked about social media earlier. A lot will come onto her and also those involved in the foundation in terms of that message, in terms of ensuring that his "We Shall Overcome" is maintained on the global sort of in global dialogue, I guess. And I'm just wondering about your own views on Pat Hume, in the sense that, does she get the credit she deserves? Given her role, which was absolutely as important to everything that John Hume achieved in his lifetime.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. And by the way, I want to revise something I just said a moment ago about not coming upon a personal letter by John Hume. I did actually, written in French, at his favorite restaurant in Strasbourg, Maison de Tanner, and the restaurateur, he showed me a letter Hume wrote when his mother died, and Hume knew his mother, who also worked at the restaurant, and they were friends. So, and he wrote this lovely letter in French. So there are, I'm sure, some letters here and there, one digs far and wide. Now to your question, Owen, thank you for about the role of Pat Hume. It's been immense, absolutely immense. And that's widely recognized, actually, and deservedly so. To take a couple of random examples, the chief celebrant of John Hume's funeral said that any history that shows John Hume but omits Pat will be an incomplete history. When the cinema run of the John Hume in America launched in the Savoy Cinema in Dublin, Pat Hume kindly agreed to participate in a panel discussion along with former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, and myself. And again, Mary McAleese said something very similar, that documentary must be made on Pat's enormous role. However, I would also add from conversation, I mean, she doesn't particularly like at all the limelight. She doesn't like being on camera. And they were, they worked extremely well as a couple and together nearly 60 years, but there was a they complemented each other, and I think Hume did occupy that public persona, and Pat was, of course, more, she was in Derry, she practically ran the SDLP office in Derry, a very, very able, very lovely woman, very loved person in Derry and beyond. Really a very noble person.
Okay, so we are reaching the end of our interview. So I would like to thank all present, especially Maurice and Owen and Sean, and all of you who are watching us and have asked questions, and especially Professor Laura Izaha and Thiago Moyano and the whole organizers behind the film series. And I would like now to pass the word to Ambassador Sean so that he can give his final remarks. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mariana, and of course to thank everybody that's been involved in putting this together. The whole week has been fascinating, and the different events that have taken place, and we are participating today. I know Jill from the the consulate in Sao Paulo will participate tomorrow, and my colleague Jackie in Argentina will also participate tomorrow in another event. But I was just thinking, one of the questions that you asked about, lessons for Brazil. I think a key thing is it takes a long time. I mean, there were lots of, let's say, false starts. The Sunningdale Agreement in 1973 didn't work because it was probably the right thing at the wrong time. It just, certainly the unionist population weren't ready for it. And it was brought down by the loyalist strikes. And I have memories of those times. But, John was, as Maurice said, he never lost an election. He was there for decades. And this is important when you really want to bring that kind of political change around, that it takes time, and that when you feel you have to have, and he always had his people behind him. He had that solid support that when there was failure, it wasn't time to abandon and go somewhere else, but to keep going. And Owen has mentioned the John and Pat Hume Foundation. I would really like to explore opportunities to use this foundation for promoting dialogue around peace everywhere that we can. And if we can do that here in Brazil, we will certainly do it. And I suppose, thanking Maurice for all this work. It's great, when you produce something that has a living legacy, and that, every day you wake up, you can assure yourself somebody's going to watch this somewhere in the world and be inspired by it. I mean, that's a wonderful gift that you have. And, I'm just left with that kind of very sobering thought that John had a brain hemorrhage in 1999, the year after the Good Friday Agreement, the year after getting all those prizes. If it had happened a few years earlier, we just don't know what would have happened. But, it's a sobering thought when you rely so much on a great person. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure, real pleasure to participate. Thanks for wonderful questions, and someday we'll do it all together.
Maybe that turbid.
No better place.
Yes, of course. It would be lovely to be face to face in Brazil, all of us, and we're all in different regions of Brazil as well. Sean is in Brasilia, Owen in Sao Paulo, I'm in Mato Grosso, and Maurice in Germany. So I think that there is a bright side into all of this. And so tomorrow we will continue with an interview with Len Collin on the film Sanctuary at 11 p.m. Brazil time. So see you then. Thank you all, and bye.